right, good evening, everyone, and hello to everyone joining us online this evening. My name is Matt Varnum. I am the Executive Director here for the Benzie Area Historical Society, and I'd like to welcome you to the Benzonia Academy Lecture Series. The Benzie Academy Lecture Series, a significant continuation of the Benzonia Academy's legacy, was established to bring modern education to Northern Michigan. This sharing of local, national, and international history. We invite you to join us on the second Thursday of each month to delve into these fascinating topics. The Benzie Area Historical Society, a nonprofit organization, relies solely on the generosity of donors and grants to maintain our historic museum, the Drake School Museum, and our operations. Your donations are instrumental in preserving, collecting, and sharing the rich history of Benzie County, and those of us at the Historical Society greatly appreciate it. A reminder, please keep your phones muted. Questions can be asked at the end of this program, and for those of you on Zoom, please feel free to insert your questions into the chat. Now, before we begin today's lecture, let me introduce our presenter, Jerry Heiman. Jerry practiced oral and maxillofacial surgery in Midland, Michigan from 1972 to 1998. He has been a Platte Lake property owner since 1977 and became a full-time Benzie County resident in 98. He was first elected to the Historical Society Board of Directors in 2007. He has served as the board president and secretary. He also serves as a member of our executive, buildings and grounds, and our programs and community outreach committees. Jerry has been a tour director for museum-sponsored historical walking, bicycle, and bus tours. He also penned 100 years ago a column in our local newspaper for more than a decade, and he also writes articles for our newsletter. It goes without saying that Jerry knows how to tell a good story. So please join me in welcoming Jerry as he presents Lumber Era Ghost Towns of Benzie, Gone but Not Quite Forgotten.
Hello. I couldn't turn my mic on because of my fat roll that was covering up the switch. So thanks for coming. I know a lot of you came only because you figured anyone that could make a historical talk out of smelt could, no telling what he was going to come up with next. So this was more traditional, and it's actually the ghost towns of Benzie County just equal lumber. They're all lumber towns. And Bill Rose, who I didn't know, but some of you knew him, was a big volunteer at the museum, actually put a whole big notebook together of 3-ring binder thing with all kinds of information about the ghost towns of Benzie County. This might be part of a series. I might do another couple that we might have in our bag. I wanted to do these two towns, obviously with my bias, because they were associated with Platte Lake. One at the top of the lake and one at the bottom end. And they ran about the same time, actually. The subjects are basically what is a ghost town? There's no buildings left, so there can't be any ghosts. You got to have buildings to have ghosts. So the term is kind of a misnomer. They're disappeared lumber towns. And I can tell you that there is not a trace of, I've looked everywhere. But I'll show you, I took pictures of what there is, so you can get a little idea. So there were lumber camps everywhere. And when does a lumber camp become a town? Oh, there are certain criteria that we use. If they had permanent houses, I use the word loosely. I mean that more than a tent. if they had a post office for sure, and a lot of them didn't, a company store, and a school particularly. Averytown didn't have hardly any of those things, but Edgewater did. It had all, it was a real town. These are just two names that you've heard, a parcel selection of ghost towns of Benzie County are Allen, Brundage, Beecher, Clark's Mill, Clary, Gerber's, Osborne, Oviatt, Pratt's, Success, it wasn't, Stormer, and Wallen, and there are many more. You know, they're all gone. We wouldn't, Averytown would have been on that list, because I'd never heard of Averytown, and you probably haven't either. And it would be on this list if it wasn't for Al Chapman, who, well, through the 20s and 30s and 40s was a reporter here for the local newspaper. And after retirement became kind of a historian, and he talked to some of the old timers that were still alive, what few there were, and found out about Averytown, and he wrote this booklet that happens to be on sale back there, and gave the rights to the museum. And so it was from his book and the very few pictures that Ed Klotz took with glass plate negatives that we even know there was at Averytown. So it's kind of interesting, and it's tied into honor, and you'll see why. So if we continue on, I'm gonna tell you where it was here in a minute, but it was there was a sawmill that was built on the Platte River by a guy named Snover. Nobody knew his first name, and there, you know, there's hardly any records or pictures, just what Al Chapman did. And we know the mill shut down by 1905, and that was no problem because the Guelph Mill in Honor was going gangbusters, and they could walk there, get a job from where they lived in Averytown. So there wasn't any unemployment associated with it. And it was during this same time frame. The Averytown name, they think, probably came from Thomas Avery, who may have been a part owner of the mill and owned a lot of real estate around the area, and he was kind of a mover and shaker of the whole scene there. And so we're going to try and figure out where this was. This is kind of busy map, so I've got a better one coming up, but just the official map, you see, if you're familiar with the four corners of Deadstream Road and Indian Hill Road, and the Indian Hill Bridge just south of there, and then on down and you hit 31. Oh, this plat map was before there was a 31. And Averytown was right in here on the bend of the river on a 40 acres owned by Louis Sands, which we're going to talk about him. And you see he also owned the whole Deadstream swamp of cedars, or at least he had the lumber rights to it. And here's, so you're driving up Indian Hill Road going north, and you look to your left as you cross, and you stop in the middle of the road if there's no traffic and take a picture. And you're looking at about where Averytown was on the south bank, or it would be the west bank, right around the curve, right in this area. And you see this little white boathouse here. We'll talk about that later. And you see right here, there's a very large brown trout lives in this hole right here. And I've spent many a night in front of that boathouse trying to fool him. So here's a sketch map that Al Chapman did that shows the situation. You got, and this is interesting for development of the area. At this time, 1898, when the town started, people had to come from Honor. If they were going west, they had to do it by going up it wasn't called Deadstream Road then, it was the Platte River Road, coming out of Honor to that Four Corners, but it wasn't Four Corners then. And the Indian Hill Road was the old Benzonia Trail heading up north. All the people that landed by boat in Glen Arbor and came down to settle Benzie County all came down the Benzonia Trail. And right where those two met, there was an old bridge over the river, but it was falling down. Something had to be done. And Snover, that built the mill, said, well, we'll build a bridge. And so instead of the bridge being where you see it now, it was over here around a couple bends. And the township said, great, now we don't have to spend money and build a bridge. We'll use your bridge. And so the road through Averytown became the main highway for anyone going west. There was no Deadstream Road yet. And if people wanted to get to Platte Lake, they had to come out here, go down through Averytown, hit Platte Lake Road, which was built early 1900s, and head on. If they wanted to go to Beulah, they went up over the hill on what is now Warden Road that became M11. So that's the setting for the town. And the main thing you got to notice on this map is there's a railroad. See, coming out of Honor, the M and NE comes out of Honor, takes a turn here and heads up toward Empire Junction, where it meets the Empire and Southeastern, so that people were connected to Empire. The only reason this branch came to Honor was because when the Guelph Mill decided in 1895 to build a hardwood mill in Honor, the condition was they would only do it if a railroad was brought into Honor. So there was enough business from them that the Manistee and Northeastern ran a branch from Platte River Junction over by Lake Ann to Honor. And then I'm not sure why, but they kept going. And that's the reason there could be an Averytown, because they kept going, put a little side spur here on the east side of the river so that they could pick up all the lumber that was produced by the mill at Averytown. So then that gets us into why Averytown was there. It had logs, and the logs were, there was a big stand of pine right here along Indian Hill Road or Benzonia Trail, downhill shot all the way to the river and the mill. There was a vast swamp of huge cedars here. Hard to believe when you drive Deadstream Road today and it's just a little scrub. But in 1900, there were 4-foot around cedars in there. They never grew back. I'm not sure why. No one seems to know. And so they had the river to clean the logs before the mill and float some logs down from, there was some pine up in here they could float down, and it had a railroad. So it had the three ingredients. It had lumber, a river, and a railroad. That's, you had to have either a railroad or a harbor to make a go of it with a sawmill. So you'll notice the property here is a lot of it is owned by Louis Sands. He owned the 40 where the town of Averytown was built. And he also had the rights to this whole Deadstream swamp full of cedar trees. More needs to be said about Louis Sands. He had a Benzie connection. He married one of the Marshall daughters of the original family that came from Ontario and settled the Marshall Road, had a bunch of kids. One of the daughters married Louis Sands. How he got up here to Benzie to find her, I'm not sure. He was the king lumberman of Manistee, owned a bunch of sawmills, he was very wealthy, but not ostentatious. And you can see that he was a sharp, shrewd businessman. He apparently financed the building of most of the structures in Averytown and knew that he was going to make a mint logging all that cedar out of the swamp. And Louis Sands was very famous among the lumberjacks. And they used to sit around the bunkhouses and make up songs and poems about him, which I will now read. And you gotta respond. It's a call and response thing. Can be sung to Michigan by Michigan, but I'm not gonna do that. Who feeds us beans? Who feeds us tea? Louis Sands and Jim McGee. That's his partner. That's your part. So, who thinks that meat's a luxury? Louis Sands. Good. We make the big trees fall kersplash and hit the ground an awful smash. And for the logs, who gets the cash? There you go. Who gives us pay for just one drunk? When we hit the Manistee kerplunk. Louis, go ahead, yeah, that you got that line too. All right. We drink our whiskey and our ale and sweep the town just like a gale. Then who comes to get us out of jail? And the final verse. I'm tearing up there. Who feeds us beans each blessed day? And when that judgment's passed and we know just where we're going to be, who will feed us beans through eternity? Now you know about Louis Sands. Thank you for your help. So anyway, he was the driving force and the money maker of this whole Averytown operation, but his main businesses were in Manistee. So this is the reasons that they built it where they did. So originally they figured, this Al Chapman from his interviews figured there were about 8 to 10 men to operate when they were sawing pine. And then when they converted the cedar to make shingles, it was up to 20. And then you got all these other people, foreman manager, bookkeeper, blacksmith, cook, and so on. And that they figured mostly 35 men, most of them were married. So there were facing rows of neat little houses were built. And then the single men, they lived in the big bunkhouse. And then you had office, blacksmith shop, horse barns. There was a large private store. This was all on that main road through Averytown. And just west of the bridge, and boarding house and storehouses. Here's one. Now, Ed Klotz, who owned the 80 just south of Louis Sands 40, it took these glass plate pictures, and there's only a few known. Al Chapman got them from Beatrice Peckins, who was F.C. Cook's daughter. F.C. Cook was early resident, a carpenter that built a lot of the buildings, built boats. His son, Oral, I actually knew a little bit. Oral lived in that house where the Honor Park is now on the river until he died at a very old age. And there was a couple of really nice brown trout lived in front of his house too. Looking downstream, you've got the mill on the left. And you examine it, this was built a lot better than most mills. It's square and plumb and got nice siding, and you can't tell it from that picture, but it was built a little fancier, as were the houses and all the buildings. And no one knows why, except that Louis Sands knew this was one of the last of the lumber towns, and maybe he wanted to do it up big because he had the money to do it. But it's only a theory. You see, here's the bridge across the river because the railroad was on the other side of the river. So they had to tote all the lumber across the bridge past the horse barn here to the railroad siding. That pine tree was supposedly still there in 91 when Al wrote this, but I can't find it now. This is the other side of the river. You see, there's the bridge, the horse barns, and probably this is a railroad freight shed, and the railroad siding was here. You see all these logs piled up, waiting to go into the holding pond they made off the river, and then into the sawmill on the other side. This was after they started logging the cedar, and you see mature cedars. This is the size that was in that dead stream swamp. They get hollow after they get mature, and all those have hollow centers, but mostly they just wanted them for shingles. And you see the company store was here. We're going to see that later. We talked about how unusually nice the buildings were. And Al found this one picture of the inside of Dr. Prentice's house. There was actually a doctor that lived there. He lived in Averytown, but his practice probably was that whole end of Benzie County. And this was his house and office. And you could tell it was put together as a pretty fancy place. Got a piano, the whole works. And Beatrice Peckins, who was a cook, remembers in talking to Al Chapman, she remembers going to some of the ladies' houses when she was a little girl and remembered how nice the houses were. And they were, actual hardwood siding and floors, and they had built by real carpenters and not just slapped up by the owner. This donkey engine here was what they used to pull the logs up out of the river and feed them into the mill. And they also moved it out into the dead stream swamp when they were logging that off to pull the cedars out to the road. And speaking of the road, I gotta tell you about that. It was in 1900, Louis Sands went to Ed Klotz and said, I want you to build a road in through that swamp so we can get the cedar out. And Ed was in charge, and he was the kind of guy that could figure out anything. So he started sinking logs into the muck and he just kept sinking logs until they hit bottom. And then they brought in wagon load after wagon load of clay and gravel on top of the logs. And in the winter, let the ice freeze, and then they could put spur roads back in off of that main road to bring the cedar logs out. And that, when you drive on Deadstream Road today, you're driving on the road that Ed Klotz built in 1900. And it went all the way down to connect with Edgewater at the other end. So what happened to the town? Well, like all lumber towns, the cedar was all cut. Honor was booming with the Guelph mill, and the residents could walk to Honor to work, and so they little by little moved to Honor for the advantages of the city life. And so by 1918, the town was pretty much abandoned. That houses, like, I said, these were really nice houses. So a lot of them were claimed and hauled away. Anyone that wanted to could get one. And the mill machinery, Oral Cook figured, was sent to Wisconsin. So the company store actually had a second life. Dave Watterson and his family came and started a fern business in about 1910 maybe. and used the company store, and you can see what a nice building it was. They had wallpaper, plate or glass windows and door, and he used it for his fern business. He could take his pick of any houses to put up his workers and relatives, family, and they went out and gathered ferns all through the woods, brought them back. They sorted them, bundled them, boxed them, and so he had guys making wood boxes there, put them on the railroad and sent them to Chicago for, I guess, probably for florists. And it was a pretty good business for quite a while. And once he'd made enough doing that to buy a farm, he just left and abandoned it. And that was the last thing going there. They talked about the boathouses there, and all the people that lived in Averytown, they were all right next to the river, and there were a string of boathouses for the launches. Some of them were used for pulling logs, and some of them were used for pleasure, to go down the river to Platte Lake and have a picnic on Birch Point and motor back up with your one-lung gasoline engine. And this is a picture of one that was left. And this next picture may be my favorite in the whole museum. This, the little guy standing, that's Oral Cook. And his big sister, Beatrice, who's one that told most of what Al Chapman learned about the place. Their dad, F.C. Cook, who was the skilled carpenter that built a lot of things there, and their mom. And this is Ed Klotz in the bigger second boat with a family of people. So these were the big figures of Averytown. And so, like I said, if you wanted a house, you get a team, jack it up, put a sleigh under it in the winter, and take the house away. That was common in a lot of lumber towns, but these were particularly nice houses. And Al said he remembers seeing one in Honor that was a real little palace. And unfortunately, it burned down in the 60s, so we didn't get to see it. And so there's one boathouse left. And I took this from downstream, and you can see it when you drive across the Indian Hill Road Bridge. It's getting a little bad shape, but it is still there. And the brown trout are still here. And this is the house that goes with it. Now, I'm not saying that was an original Averytown house, but it might have been moved there. And the interesting story about that house is it was owned by Marston Dame, who is a big politician. The marina in Northport is named after him. And he had a good friend that used to come and stay there all the time with him when they'd fish and hunt, Chase Osborne, the ex-governor from Sault Ste. Marie, was a frequent guest there. And that's his boathouse down there. And it was most recently owned by John Smith, the barber of Sutton's Bay, who was very well known in Sutton's Bay. Everyone knew him, and he just died very recently. I saw it in the Levi Enterprise. They had a big, long obituary. I got to talk to him once and go in the house because I met him there and saw all the old log books and stuff of Chase Osborne and Marston Dame. And the other guest that was there, everything is connected, you see, was Fred Green. When he used to come up to dip smells in Beulah, the governor stayed there. And Smith said he had a picture somewhere of Fred Green standing at a table outside this house cleaning smelt, our governor, and he couldn't find it. I said, God, I want that picture, and he never could find it. So that's the Averytown portion, half my time. And we'll save the questions for the end, because I'm going to launch right into Edgewater, the other end of the lake, and a little more known. A lot of you have heard of Edgewater more than Averytown, I'm sure. And it was, here's another one of those busy maps, a 1901 Platte map. See Platte Lake here? And right there's the river as it leaves Platte Lake to M22. And just to the east of there is where Edgewater was, the mill and the town. And then they built a railroad from there down to Lake Michigan, where they built a big dock and loaded the lumber that they produced at the mill. You can still walk that railroad. Just to get your bearings. So here's Edgewater, the river exit. And over here, they had two big landings, one about where White City is and one about where Thompson's Resort would have been. And that was to get all this lumber that they had leases to on these hills south of the lake, was all hardwoods, and down in the low ground was all hemlock. So they cut the logs, slid them down the hill, and loaded them on barges or made the floating booms out of them, took them across the lake to the mill. They'd cut all winter, stack them on the bank, put them in the lake in the spring and bring them across the mill, start the mill up and run the mill all summer. So how did it start? Charlie Schultz got a homestead grant, which was meant mostly for people that are going to improve land and farm it. But old Charlie, he didn't want to be no farmer. He was going to build a sawmill on his property. I guess that counted too. The only other people in that whole region were the Botts brothers, just the next property east on that side of the lake, who did farm, and they were the first ones to cut a trail from the Frankfurt Empire Road in to their property on that side of the lake. It was an ox trail that allowed you to get in there. So he put up the sawmill, got people hired, built the railroad, built the dock, and had a contract with the Platte River Lumber Company of Chicago for 5,000 board feet of hardwood lumber per year. That doesn't seem like much. That may have been a misprint. I don't know if it was 5,000 or 50,000, as you'll see later, delivered to their schooner at the dock. And they had, like I said, they had leases for all the hardwood in the hills and the hemlock. They were doing fine till 1890. There was a disagreement. The contract was broken, and the lumber company in Chicago sent one of their guys up to run it. And that was John Little, and his sons came up to take over. And they made the mill really grew then. It got, they were putting out 20,000 board feet a day, and plus the hemlock bark. And it grew. They had a company store, they had a post office and a school, all the requirements. And they were cutting wood like crazy and sending it down to the dock at the bay. I like to think that this is what it looked like when only the Botts brothers were there and before Edgewater started. And this picture, we don't know where it was, and I like to think it's that corner of Platte Lake, but a little too high a land there, so it may not be, but it shows what I wanted to show about what the area was like before they started civilizing it. Here's the mill that Charlie built. Typical, every sawmill in northern Michigan looks the same. They were all, lumber comes up the conveyor, the second floor where the saw goes through to the first floor, back and forth. And they wash it in the lake first, not to dull the saws. Lumber comes out the other end to the waiting flat cars to take it down to the dock. You see they had the rain barrels on the roof in case of fire, and there were lots of fires. I'm not sure if the rain barrels were so, if the fire broke out, someone would be nominated to go up the ladder and tip the barrels over. Or if when the fire reached the roof and the roof caved in, the water then would come down from the barrels when it was way too late. Suffice to say that most sawmills burned down. This is another view. You see the sawmill on the left, and then back here, the other buildings. This is probably the hotel boarding house where the visiting salesmen and contract buyers and stuff would stay. And all the logs piled up here. There's logs everywhere. This is building the railroad, the Edgewater and Lake Michigan Railroad, 1 mile long. And then after they were done with Edgewater, they took up the rails and took them over to Carter Siding where the Desmond chemical plant was. And these guys, I'm always amazed at how they can do that back-breaking work dressed in a suit. And all the pictures, maybe they just grabbed their jacket and put it on for the picture, I suppose. And here's the dock out in the Lake Michigan and the lumber schooner getting loaded. Now, there was no harbor to protect it, so you know that dock took a beating every winter. And you know they probably had to replace most of the pilings every spring. So it was a never-ending job. On the lake side, you had all these piers and posts and walkways, people prodding logs around, get them where they're supposed to be. Those posts, when I first came up here, they were still barely just sticking above the water. And then they got so they were just under the water, wonderful prop catchers. And so people went out and put jugs on them. Now they're pretty much all the way over. But you know, if you look carefully, you can see them down there, along with all the old slab wood. This is the mud hen. And there's stories about the mud hen. It was a paddle wheel, steam-powered barge that they used on the lake to tow the scows full of hemlock bark across and the rafts of logs. And the mud hen was a cursed boat and had nothing but problems. But, you know, it functioned for several years. There's a reading from Joe Vincent. If I have time, I'll tell you about the mud hen, but I'll save it, see if we have time. They had a side hustle going in hemlock bark because hemlock bark was very, very valuable for the leather tanneries. And they didn't care about the hemlock tree so much. And here you see a stark naked hemlock tree. They peeled all that bark off with those axes. These guys were so good with those axes. And the hemlock bark peels pretty easy. So they'd pile it up on the wagons and take it out of the woods. This is probably looking from the sawmill back into the village. And you can see that there were considerable buildings and a bunch of families. It got up to about 200 people at its maximum that were said to live there or in the environs, including some you might know. The lady with the wash tub was Hap Amadon's mother. Hap Amadon's the one that founded the Water Wheel Resort. So the Amadons were one family that came here because of Edgewater. There were several others, the Nostrants, Robinsons, the Ritas, all came here because of that and stayed. There were some substantial buildings there, you can see. This is the locomotive, which gets us into the legend of the locomotive in Platte Lake, which we've been plagued with that story for years, that I know there's a locomotive in Platte Lake from the mill. Well, this was the locomotive. It wasn't a locomotive at all. It was a boxcar with a steam engine, boiler, and a chain drive to the wheels. It could make 10 miles an hour with a tailwind downhill. And it was used to haul these, the boards down to Lake Michigan. And anyone that wanted to hop on and get a ride down to the lake could, and all the kids did, and then they'd ride it back. But if indeed it was run into the lake when they closed the mill, it would be just a pile of boards by now, and there's many, many piles of boards on the bottom. But people that have dove there have come up with wheels. We have a set at the museum, which are a little too heavy for me to carry over here. Other people have them in their yards and buckets of nuts and bolts and things that they retrieve from the bottom. No one's ever found a boiler though. So the legend of the locomotive in Platte Lake is, as far as I can tell, just a legend. They had, I counted 48 men in this picture that worked there. I'm pretty sure that this is Mr. Little and his two sons. I can't tell you who these guys are, but the two little kids with boxing gloves on for the entertainment of the crew. And I don't know, the black kid, I don't know where he came from. I don't see any of his race in the workers here, but he must have lived there around the camp somewhere. So they had the kids duking it out. And there was a school. The school outlasted the town by quite a bit. It lasted until 1920 as school district number, Jane would know, one of the school districts of the county. And then 1920, it was consolidated, and that building, I think part of it might have become the core of Tom Rumney's house on the lake. At least that's what his wife said. I looked at it once, and yeah, could be. So today you can see, if you walk the railroad grade, and you can still see the lumber, because it was such a nuisance to the people that built cottages along there that they went out and drug a bunch of it up on the shore to try and make a beach that wasn't all boards. And I went over and took up some of those boards from the bottom because they sink, and took them over to my place to make a fish structure. And when I pulled them up off the bottom, I could still see the saw marks. And you know, that was the first time that those things had seen daylight since 1890. You can still see the marks of the saw. And that's the end of the formal pictures. We'll have discussion time because unlike most of my lectures, I finished in good time. And in fact, I finished in time to read Joe Vinson, who you're going to love. He lived on Platte Lake. He was born and raised, born in 1880. This is from Edith and Bill Overlease's book we have there, Daylight in the Swamp, where they interviewed all the old loggers before they died. And he talked about Edgewater because he was right across the lake growing up. Said, well, we used to grow vegetables right here where these houses are on Platte Lake. Clear across 40 acres there, tomatoes and sweet corn, early potatoes, general garden truck. This old scow that we had, just as wide as one end, it wasn't the other, a good deal like a wagon box, turned up at the ends. We were 15 and 13, and they closed the mill at Edgewater down for 15 minutes, and they'd all run down there and everybody grabbing what they could get, you see. In a few minutes, they'd have it all, and then a few days later, we'd go again for with a load. And then he talked about the mud hen, and said that one time they rigged up a temporary dock to land these big scows that had the flat cars on. It was up the beach here about half a mile. They put some logs out and fixed it up so they could dock that scow there, but it wasn't quite deep enough. They thought it was. They loaded 4 cars on, but the tug couldn't pull away. It was left sitting on the ground, you see. There was a bunch of us young gaffers going to ride that thing over to Edgewater. So the fellow come out of the woods with the team. He got a good sized stick of timber, I'd say 6 or 7 inches through, shoved it down between the dock, clear down to the bottom. Then he hooked the steam on to kind of pry it away, get it into a little deeper water, and he did. We pried it away so the tug got off the beach. A bunch of us young gaffers, we come on, and this Horton fellow, he see the gall darn scow was sinking, so he hollered, "Pump, pump, you buggers, pump." He had a pump on each end, handmade pump with a rocker arm, you know, and it just brought water running off the deck. Well, by golly, it was trying to make Birch Point. There was a big sandbar there, and he figured he'd run it up on that sandbar and it would be easier picked up later. By gol darn, if we hadn't worked that like painters, it'd never have made the point. He got it on the bar and then unhooked it and left it. You see, when he stuck that log down, it sprung the boards on the side of the boat, and that's what made it leak. So the mud hen, that was the life of the mud hen. And now I'm going to let other people participate. Your memories of Edgewater and Averytown. Anyone got questions? Matt has a microphone. We'll repeat the question for those at home. Anyone?
Yeah, Jerry, I'm just wondering, did any part of the Averytown land use what's now the Cherry Bowl Theater?
No, it was part of Ed Klotz's 80, just south of Averytown. It was sold off by actually when Beatrice Cook married Ed Klotz, and so she inherited that. Oral Cook inherited that land eventually and sold it off to the Cherry Bowl, the plumbing store and all that. But that was south of Averytown. All the Averytown land is owned by, is it Ron? Who's the Mead that has the place right on the river there, the house on the river. He lives there full time. And he's been very nice about letting us walk on his front yard in the evening fishing. But he owns that land across, and it's all just woods and swamp. There's absolutely nothing there. Railroad siding? Interestingly, Al discusses that there were people that said there was a railroad siding on that side of the river, but Beatrice and Oral and all these old timers swear there was never a railroad on the outside of the river. It was strictly the north side. So they said there's never anything built south of the river. So they said.
Could you hear?
Yeah.
So the road through Averytown, north-south, would have gone through the Cherry Bowl, maybe.
It did. If you know, Al said you could still trace it out in 91 when he wrote this and kind of see the track. It went kind of across that big bare field, kind of through where the Cherry Bowl was, and then joined what is now what's the extension of Warden Road that comes down to 31? Covey or Moss Road. So yeah, that was kind of the general route of that road. And that's how everyone had to go through Averytown after they built that bridge there, because there was no bridge until 1910 or so where it is now. And that's why there was a fancy boarding house there, because all the traffic coming through would stay there and eat. And yes, you're right, the road continued across that big open land of Klotz's and where the Cherry Bowl is, and then up the hill. Anyone else? Up front.
this is not exactly a question, but we've been here since 1987. And I can't tell you the number of times that I've taken the pontoon boat out with 5, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds to the slag pile there. And the fun thing is they catch one right after another.
You do.
The bad thing is you can't clean any of them. They're not big enough usually. But
I like it.
the kids just absolutely love it. Even to this day, you could still see the slag down there. You can still see
all right.
the bent over poles.
The caution with that is you put your anchor down there,
You can't get it up.
you might not get it back.
Yeah.
I've had to dive more than once down to free the anchor. Because I took the grandkids over there for the same reasons.
When we first came here in the eighties, we would take the canoes down the river and sometimes you would find, pieces of log that were like the ends of a log cut off. And some of them were stamped. And we were told that there were pirates on the river who would cut off the ends and re-stamp the logs.
Well, that certainly was true in lumbering log drives in general, yes. People would do that. And they probably hung them if they caught them. And, but there, on that particular operation there, you had the hardwood logs owned by, there weren't any other competing loggers in the area, just the Platte River Lumber Company. But it certainly could have been, there could have been some log stealing going on, but that's how they did steal logs. They cut that brand, the stamp off the end and put their own on or have no stamp, yeah. And all they had to do was somehow get them down to Lake Michigan somehow, and they could load them, sell them to a lumber hooker who would take them off to a mill down the lake somewhere. You live on the lake, apparently? Oh, you're on the river, okay. Supposedly, in front of your house, there was and when he wrote this, you could still see the remains of one of those big box barges that they brought hemlock across in that was sunk there in the river. You see strange looking board structures there, that's what it is. Yes.
So on the corner of, well, let me piggyback that. I brought my 2 sons because they do fishing in that spot that you're.
Did they fall
speaking
asleep?
of. No, but also, if you still travel the river, you can see some of those big logs, those, deadhead ends of logs. So that is pretty interesting, but that's so what I was gonna mention, where Indian Hill and 31 meet, and then you cross to go up to Marshall. Was that part of Averytown? Because there is, if you look in that, wooded area, there is a cabin there that's, it's.
Yeah,
broken
there's that
down.
one old,
Yeah,
one spooky ghost house
Yeah.
there, right near the power substation, you mean?
maybe.
Yeah, I
it's
don't know if that
remnants of
building
something.
would have been there in Averytown time, but it looked like it could have been.
It does.
Yeah.
As you were talking.
Of course, that would, that Averytown wasn't along that road. Averytown was downriver a couple bends.
Sure.
But that was the Benzonia Trail where the bridge washed out and there wasn't a bridge, so the Averytown Road became the main road. But that house could have been from that time. It's possible.
Yeah, interesting.
Anyone else? Well, with that, now you know about Edgewater and Averytown. And next time you're driving by, you'll be able to show your friends.